The environment of organizations is increasingly global in nature. In this short video lecture, we're going to discuss the importance of the concept of national culture on management. Global business has a growing impact. Even small companies get involved internationally early on in their life cycle. New markets are available. There's an increasing demand for global services. You have companies here in the US that enable 24-hour processing of software by sending things to be done overnight to India, where it's not overnight. There's low-cost manufacturing available in China, and many US companies have set up manufacturing options there, such as Apple Computer. But in some industries, Vietnam, Bangladesh, or Costa Rica may be cheaper options. For companies headquartered in the US, the management practices might not necessarily translate to different cultures. And this would apply to a company headquartered in Germany. Their management practices might not translate so well. And the paradox is that it might be easier to adjust to a very different culture than it is to a very similar culture because of our assumptions. We assume that a similar culture is going to be similar, and thus we don't do our homework. We don't investigate potential differences, say, between Canada and the United States, where we would expect that doing business in China is going to be significantly different than doing business here in the US. Culture is critical to successful global business, but yet it's the hardest thing for managers to understand and to implement. In describing cultures, we tend to stress the differences and overlook the similarities. And we also tend to stereotype. So we think of Germans as being very precise, Swiss as being very clean. Scandinavians are known for their design. And this type of stereotyping may be inevitable for people who lack frequent contact with another culture. Additionally, cultures are not homogeneous. There can be differences in the culture due to gender, age, socioeconomic status, the geographic regions. You know, we also always talk about in the United States the difference between the North and the South. And so this can make the understanding of national culture a little bit more complicated. Culture is often reflected by customs, some of which are very visible. For instance, dress and how we address people. So in the US, casual days are very common. Many companies have casual Fridays. In other countries, removing one's shoes is natural. You wouldn't walk in the house. You take off your shoes before you enter the house. In Germany and Japan and other countries. And some countries are more formal in terms of addressing other people. In Germany, my name would be Frau Dr. Edith Bussia, and very few people, just my intimate friends, would call me Edie. And titles especially are much more important in countries not so important in the United States. Business cards, essential in Latin America, Europe, and Japan, even in this day of electronic devices and friending people and linking in with people. And personal space. The distance that you stand the distance that you allow between someone that you're speaking with, it's much smaller in Latin America, Spain, and Italy. They will stand much closer, be very comfortable with this. In the US, our personal space that most people are comfortable is about 3 feet. And that can be uncomfortable for someone doing business, doing negotiations in a country where the personal space is much smaller. The concept of time is much more fluid in Latin America, Spain, and Italy. And the concept of what it means to be late is also more fluid. In a small country in Eastern Europe, actually the agency of lateness is even described differently, where I might say, I missed the bus, that's why I'm late to work. They might say, the bus was traveling so fast that I couldn't reach it, and that's why I'm late to work. So even the agency perspective is different. Time off work in many Northern European countries, 6 weeks vacation. August is a time when the country is closed. Many of my examples are coming from Germany because I have studied and worked there. The working hour and pace in Europe, especially Germany, they're not open 24/7. So even in a small town like Bowling Green here in the US, Walmart's open, Meijer's open, restaurants, not very many restaurants are open, but there's much more access to things 24/7. I was in Austria a few years ago studying, and after 11 o'clock at night, about the only place you could grab a bite to eat was a gas station. All right, just it shuts down. And then the pace of work. Latin America, Middle East, and Japan, the relationship needs to be established before getting down to business, and even in a business meeting, the initial portions of a business meeting are dealing with the relationship rather than getting to the task at hand. And for some very fast-paced Americans, this can be frustrating. Even the customs of eating and drinking, you can see some visible differences, right? Beverages of choice, tea in Japan, coffee in Egypt, vodka in Russia, having a pint of beer over lunch in the United Kingdom, and some dietary restrictions. In India, there's no beef. In Islamic countries, no pork or alcohol. When I visited Jordan, I was surprised that they had such a vibrant wine industry. They produce some good wines there, but they're not consumed locally. They're exported to other countries because primarily the population is Muslim and they don't drink. Hofstede developed the cultural dimensions that are discussed in your text, and they're called the Hofstede's Big Four or Big Five or Hofstede's Six, depending on the cultural dimensions that are discussed. In this instance, we're looking at the valued dimensions developed by Hofstede. It's based on a survey of IBM employees worldwide in, I believe, 62 countries. They collected this data over a very long period of time. And the 4 big dimensions that emerged were collectivism versus individualism, power distance, uncertainty avoidance, masculine femininity, and time orientation. These dimensions have been criticized because the data is old and did not include lesser developed economies in its initial data gathering process. However, data collected in the 90s and in the early 2000s and in the world's values surveys that's been conducted over the last 15 years, they have reaffirmed this structure. And while it is also criticized because it's looking at averages and comparing averages of one country to averages in another, it's a good place to start when thinking about doing business and has some value for managers in making business decisions. Collectivism versus individualism is getting at the concept or the value of dependence on others. And it deals with the identification with the group versus the identification as an individual. The we versus I, if you will. So collective cultures think in terms of in-groups and out-groups. Life decisions are made by the group. You look after your in-group no matter what. And in individualistic cultures, concern for self and immediate family and individual achievement are more important, more highly valued. Here's a mapping of how countries scored on individualism. So these would be countries that countries in red. The United States is highlighted there, Australia, the United Kingdom. They scored high on individualism. You'll notice that China, let's see if I can get my arrow in here, China scored lower. Some countries in Africa scored lower on individuality. Countries in Western Europe are in the mid-range, as are the Latin countries. And actually, the U.S. is scored the highest on individualism, and Guatemala scored the lowest. The portions of the map that are in gray are where we don't have data reported. And so Western societies tend to be more individualistic, and Eastern societies tend to be more, Asian societies tend to be more collective. The next dimension is power distance, and that is the extent to which a culture accepts that power is distributed unevenly. Now, that doesn't mean that in low power distance countries that power is distributed equally. It has to do with how the society accepts that distribution. In higher power distance countries, there's the view that people have a place in society. They either have high status or low status, and that's accepted. Superiors are to be respected, and there's less trust and cooperation. Lower power distance societies are a little bit more egalitarian. Equal rights for everyone. Hierarchies are established for convenience, not to protect individuals' positions in society, and that there is the freedom to judge power as being legitimate or not. This is a map of the power distance index, and again here, orange and red. It doesn't look like anybody's in the really deep red, but you can see that the Asian countries here have a higher index and are more accepting. Mexico has a higher index. United States and the Scandinavian countries tend to score lower. And then there's some countries that are in the middle. Here's Korea. And Korea has kind of a medium power index. That's a little bit on the high side, above average. But they talk about an example of a cultural explanation for plane crashes that were occurring. And part of it, they argue, was due to the fact that there was a high power distance index. You respect your superior, you wouldn't argue with your superior, so that the flight technical assistants wouldn't argue or wouldn't be aggressive in disagreeing with the captain. And so the captain would say what they were going to do, and the technical assistants, even though they may have disagreed or may have had some other kind of information, the way they presented it to the captain was an indication of deference, and that led to poor decision making. So it's kind of an interesting example. I'm sure there are other reasons that have been put forth, but that is the cultural diagnosis of several of these plane crashes. Uncertainty avoidance deals with fear of the unknown. It's the extent to which a society feels threatened by ambiguity and uncertainty. And countries high in uncertainty avoidance, there's lots of rules. There's acceptance of authority. There's avoidance of conflict, right? Because that would create more uncertainty. Countries with low uncertainty avoidance tolerate constructive conflict. Aggression is less accepted, and they look to common sense. So here's a map of the uncertainty avoidance index, and you can see here is that we're pretty, as a rule, nobody's in the really low light yellow area, because as human beings, we don't like uncertainty, and there are a few countries that are really in the high area. Greece is the country with the highest uncertainty avoidance index. And here again, lots of rules and regulations. Why? Because they make the future more certain, because you know what behaviors are expected from you. Masculinity and femininity, it's also called the quality of life. That's the extent to which society values typical masculine values such as assertiveness and acquisition of things, as opposed to caring for others and quality of life. In masculine cultures, there tend to be very clear gender roles. They live to work. Ambition, achievement, success are valued. In feminine cultures, there tends to be more sympathy for the unfortunate, more of a work to live as opposed to live to work attitude, and people are important. So here we have a map, and high masculine countries. So the deeper the color red indicates more of a masculine orientation, and the paler, a more feminine orientation. And again, the gray indicates that we don't have data for that country available. Finally, we look at time orientation, long-term versus short-term. Countries with a long-term orientation look to the future, value thrift and persistence. In the short term, it's more the here and now, and are more accepting of change. And again, here's the map of countries with a long-term orientation. So paler countries are have more of a short-term orientation. That would include the U.S. And then you see China and Japan having the most intense reds, indicating a much longer term orientation. So what are some of the managerial implications of all of this? Well, some of our management practices that we engage in the U.S. may not work so well. For example, participative management, where you include your subordinates in decision making. It can improve profitability in countries that have low power distance, but in countries where it has high power distance, that's viewed as not being acceptable, and so it won't work as well. Quick fixes can improve profitability in more short-term oriented cultures, and so if you think of the U.S., we're like the king of quick fixes. But in long-term oriented cultures, it wouldn't be viewed as being appropriate. Merit-based pay and promotion policies, right? Promoting people on the basis of their performance. In more masculine countries, countries that are more achievement-oriented, that works. In more feminine cultures, doesn't work as well. And then another example is in individualistic cultures, the emphasis of individual contributions can improve profitability, but it actually worsens profitability in more collectivistic cultures because they think that it's inappropriate for someone to be individually rewarded. And actually, the person, we call these Hofstede's 5 value dimensions, and basically he got interested in this work because he was interviewing, he's from the Netherlands, and he was interviewing with an American company. And in the Netherlands, the resumes are very brief. The individuals tend to undersell themselves and expect the interviewer to ask questions to see, what they can and can't do. While Americans, we tend to have, a lot of superlatives on our resume and oversell ourselves a bit in the interview, right? Telling them, yeah, we can do this. I can take on this project. I can handle it. And so when he was interviewing for an American company, he didn't get the job, and he felt part of it was this cultural thing because he didn't sell himself enough. And so he became interested in this whole cultural values part of management. And then later he went on to work at IBM and gather all this data, and then he retired about 20 years ago, but he's still working, and he's the head of the Cross-Cultural Institute in the Netherlands. And questions that come up, and he's been asked a lot, but basically, do national borders equal cultural borders? Right? Because there are some countries that have multiple cultures, such as Canada, Belgium, India, and Brazil. And what additional research has demonstrated that even though there may be the Francophone culture in Canada, right, Quebec is French and the rest of Canada is Anglo, that there are more similarities between Quebec and the rest of Canada, and then there's a difference between, they identify mostly as Canadians, so that the national border actually trumps. There was another study that involved looking at religions, right, because there are global religions, the Catholic Church, Islam, Tao, Judaism, and Hinduism, and Buddhism. Sorry, I keep on thinking of these religions. And that what they found was that national culture trumps religion. They found that there was more similarity in values between Sunni Egyptians and Christian Egyptians than there was between Sunni Egyptians and Sunni Jordanians. And so that this national border is really a relevant way of looking at culture. And then finally, there are some culturally homogeneous areas. Scandinavia, still national culture is still trumping, but if you're a company like McDonald's that's in over 200 countries, it helps to do a little bit of clustering. And this can be useful in terms of advertising and possibly in terms of product offerings. Maybe need to tweak in terms of management practices, but they've, the Middle Eastern countries, East Central Europe, Asians, Northern Europe, the one thing that we really do lack is an understanding of the African countries and some of the developing countries in South America and Asia. They've been understudied. We are thinking, because as we expand our research to include more countries, it's being substantiated. So we're not expecting big surprises when, well, we haven't looked at Somalia, but we've looked at Egypt and Chad and Eritrea. We're not expecting big surprises when we finally do get to gathering data in those areas. I hope this has been informative and added a little bit more to the text discussion of Hofstede's National Cultural Value Dimensions. Thank you for listening.